Hello, my name is Sarah Jane and I am a zoo veterinarian. As part of BIAZA's celebration of International Men's Day, which focuses on mental health, I've been asked to speak to you on compassion fatigue, which is something that I have struggled with personally and something which I think we need to be talking more about when we think about people that work with animals and people that work in zoos. So over this talk, I shall discuss my experience with compassion fatigue, what compassion fatigue is, and then we'll move on to why carers get compassion fatigue. We'll also touch on the symptoms of compassion fatigue and approaches that you can take to mitigate and treat compassion fatigue. So firstly, a few warnings and disclaimers. So I am not a medic. I'm a veterinarian who has suffered from compassion fatigue and wants to share her story in the hope that it starts conversations and maybe helps someone. I'm a veterinarian because even though I really like people, the thought of having to deal with their bodily functions when they are ill really makes me feel quite physically sick. So I don't have any qualifications in this area, and I'm definitely not out to diagnose anyone. I'm sharing my own personal experiences. My experience with poor mental health has led me to do a lot of reading and seeking out information, so I shall also be sharing some of what I've found. And I'll also be expressing some of my own views in this talk, and I will make it clear when I'm doing so. If anything from this talk resonates with you, or you have any concerns for either yourself or a colleague, then please seek appropriate medical advice. And the second warning is that I am talking about a mental health problem. So I shall be briefly discussing some of the symptoms, which can include self-harm, addictive behaviour and thoughts of suicide. If you aren't feeling particularly strong today, that's fine, but I would suggest not listening any further. Just park this for a better day to keep yourself safe. Okay, so let's get started. First, I'd like to explain how I have ended up here. I graduated from vet school in 2012, and despite how this photo looks, I really did love my time at vet school. This is a photo that was taken for me my final year when I was completely wiped out after a night shift in my university small animal hospital. It was tough, and there always seemed to be a lot to learn and not really enough time to learn it all in, but I'm the type of person that enjoys learning, so on the whole, that was fine. Vet school is also a very special time in lots of vets' lives because of when it occurs. So I started vet school when I was 19. I was still learning how to be an adult and what type of person I wanted to be. I was living away from my family home for the first time, which was scary at first, but vet school soon became my other home, and the lifelong friends I made there became another family. At the time I was at vet school, I think the culture of talking about mental health was just beginning to change, but hadn't quite got there yet. It is so much better now, and there are so many conversations going on around this to prepare graduates. But I wouldn't say that I ever felt very prepared for how tough working with animals can be or how it might impact me. There's a statistic that is always talked about in veterinary medicine, and that is that veterinary surgeons have a proportional mortality ratio for suicide approximately 4 times that of the general population. So in simple terms, what that means is that if you're a vet surgeon, you are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. Undoubtedly, that's a horrible, really scary statistic, but looking back now, I don't think I ever really understood what that meant, and I didn't have any real appreciation of why that was a thing. I certainly never thought that either myself or a friend or colleague would ever become a statistic, and to be honest, I don't think I ever really had any appreciation of mental illness or the spectrum of disorders that you can see. I'd had a very good life. I still would consider myself to have a very good life. So mental illness was just this airy-fairy thing that I'd heard spoken about, but I'd never seen or experienced. And if vet school gave me a new family and a new home for 6 years, then graduation took it away from me. I think for me this was maybe particularly extreme because I left vet school with a very specific career path in mind. I've always wanted to be a zoo vet. And I perceived, whether correctly or incorrectly, I perceived that my job choices were limited. I had to go where the appropriate experience was. So I moved to the other side of the country, to a city where I didn't know anyone. One of my best friends from vet school was a sort of 40 to 50 minute drive away. So suddenly, compared to the last 6 years, and the 19 years before that, when I was living with my lovely family in our wonderful home, compared to that, I was alone. and I found myself on a massive learning curve. I suddenly had to put all of this stuff that I'd learned at vet school into practice. I had to pull information out the recesses of my mind, and I had to do it really quickly. I saw a new person with a new animal that had a new problem every 15 minutes. Understandably, it can take a while to hit your groove with that. But I also had additional responsibilities. I now worked as part of a team, and I think we can all appreciate the joys that come when you work as a team with groups of people or with different personalities, different opinions, and different capabilities. In many ways, I think that was more difficult to get accustomed to than the pace of the clinical work. In the beginning of my career, I do think I actually coped quite well, and I would make sure I was still exercising. I would socialise with new people I'd met in my city. I'd phone family and friends, and I'd make that 40-50 minute drive to see my nearest vet school friend on a fairly regular basis. But somewhere along the line, and I'm still not sure when that was, I stopped doing all of that. I stopped taking care of myself without even realising it. And I still don't know how that happened, but I think it was quite complex. Maybe work was tough, so I stopped all of that because I was tired. And then work got harder because I'd stopped doing all of those things and all I had left was work. All I know is that by the middle of my second year in practice, I was very ill. And the days were long and they were roller coasters. The days where it was just bad news after bad news, almost easier to deal with. They were the easier days. Far easier than the days when I would jump between delivering bad news and then a vaccination consultation for someone who was super excited about the new puppy they got. The education I'd received at vet school meant that I could clinically do my job, but I wasn't prepared for the emotional toil of my work. By the beginning of my third year in practice, I had a medical diagnosis of depression, but in all honesty, that didn't change anything. I carried on exactly as I had been doing because I needed to look after the animals. And I fell into thinking that this was just what being a vet was like. By the beginning of 2016, I was done with being a vet. And so, like all good, responsible adults, I decided the best thing to do was run away. And I ran as far away as I possibly could, and I made the move to Australia. My partner and I travelled around for a few months, and for the first time in a long time, I felt more like me. But inevitably, the money was always going to run out, and when it did, I had to find work. And what do I do for a job? Veterinary medicine. So I had to go back to a job that I thought was making me ill. I didn't think I had any other options. Of course, I now know this to be completely false, but actually working as a vet in Australia is what's kept me going. I honestly do not think I would still be a vet if I hadn't worked there. I'm not saying that Australia or the profession there is perfect. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but I generally found a culture that was much more open than the one I was used to, and one which appreciated the work-life balance a lot more. I was so incredibly lucky to wind up working with such a supportive team of vets and nurses at the RSPCA New South Wales, and I really feel like I owe them so much. Seeing the supportive behaviour around me, hearing the story of others, I think it really made me take stock and examine myself, and I could see that I was surviving. I definitely was not thriving. So I sought medical help. My GP in Sydney was brilliant and referred me to a psychologist. It turned out that I didn't have just depression. And I don't mean that to sound demeaning because it's never just depression. But it turned out that I had PTSD and I was suffering from compassion fatigue. Some of the symptoms of both of these are very similar, but for this talk, I shall be focusing on compassion fatigue. So what is compassion fatigue? I think before we can define that, we first need to define mental ill health and mental health. These definitions are taken from the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization considers it to be really difficult to define mental ill health because mental health disorders can affect people in very different and unique ways. However, it defines mental health as a state of well-being in which an individual realises his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. It's far more than just an absence of mental disorders or mental ill health. And it's an integral part of overall health. We really need to move away from this distinction between mental health and physical health. And mental health is really complex. It's determined by a whole host of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. So compassion fatigue can be considered a mental health disorder or a mental illness. Dr. Charles Figley once said that compassion fatigue is a state experienced by those helping people or animals in distress. And it's a very extreme state of tension and preoccupation with suffering of those being helped, to the degree that it can create secondary traumatic stress for the helper. Dr. Frank Ockberg said that over time, your ability to feel and care for others becomes eroded through overuse of your skills of compassion. I always think it's really important to consider compassion fatigue on a spectrum. So the bit that I've highlighted, compassion stress, I think that compassion stress, personally, I feel like that is a normal part of everyday life. You know, sometimes we have really good days and other times we have really bad days where you just want to go home and eat chocolate and drink wine and not really talk to anyone. And I think those are part of normal life, and I think they're part of normal life when you work with animals. I think the issues happen when those bad days begin to outweigh the good days, and as Dr. Charles Figley says, you become preoccupied with those bad days and with the things that you're seeing. And then obviously at the other end of this spectrum, which we want to avoid at all costs, is a secondary traumatic stress response. So that is how I've always understood compassion fatigue to work. Certainly that was sort of what I read when I was first told that I was suffering from it. But confusingly, over recent years, it's been suggested that compassion fatigue should be renamed empathetic distress disorder. And that's due to studies that have been carried out on what parts of the brain are activated when someone has compassion fatigue. So it's important to understand this, that we know the difference between empathy and compassion. So empathy allows us to resonate with other people's feelings. So in this review paper, Compassion Does Not Fatigue by Tricia Dowling, Dowling explains this using euthanasia of an animal as an example. So as a vet, I can sympathise with how the owner or keeper is feeling, and that allows me to help them and the animal through what is a really difficult experience. And then compassion is a feeling of concern for someone or something and a strong motivation to improve that someone or something's well-being. So in the euthanasia example, compassion allows me to consider ways in which I can make the process as stress-free and as easy as possible for everyone involved. Now, the reason for the suggested name change is because magnetic resonance imaging of the brains of people with compassion fatigue has shown that the areas of the brain involved in developing empathy are the ones that are activated. That's the anterior insula and the anterior middle cingulate cortex. I hope I've pronounced those correctly. Those are the areas that you can see in the image in the top left. So however, in people with compassion fatigue or empathetic distress disorder, it's hypothesized that for some reason they have an issue with self-other determination. So going back to the euthanasia example that Dowling uses, someone with this issue would have a problem differentiating between their own grief or pain and the grief and pain of the others around them, and even the pain experienced by an animal. And this results in the overactivation of an area of the brain that processes threat and pain, and that is the amygdala, which you might be able to see in the image on the lower left. Chronic use of this circuit in the brain reduces levels of a hormone called dopamine, and that reduces our ability to feel pleasure and it decreases our motivation. So the reason that someone can have issues with self-determination can be complex. So think back to that slide on mental health definitions and how that can be impacted by socioeconomic and environmental conditions. Compassion, on the other hand, has been shown to increase levels of dopamine in our brain, and that enhances positive emotions in response to negative situations. So many now argue that increased compassion is actually what is needed to fight compassion fatigue, which we should maybe now call empathetic distress disorder. It can all get a bit confusing, right? But I'd ask you to bear with me for just one more slide. I'll continue to use the phrase compassion fatigue to prevent any further confusion. But I'd really like to explain some of the things that I found out that helped me when I was looking at traumatic stress responses in the brain. So we've discussed the spectrum of compassion, from stress, which is the ups and downs of day-to-day life, to fatigue, when those downs begin to outweigh the ups. And now I'd like to touch on the very extreme end, which is compassion stress. And that's the end of the spectrum that we really want to avoid. This end of the spectrum has a lot in common with PTSD, which I've mentioned I have experience of. So when the pathways in the brain are chronically activated, you get an increase in something called glucocorticoids. This is another hormone. It's not bad. Glucocorticoids aren't bad. You have glucocorticoids whizzing around your body right now, and in fact they help keep you alive every single day. But when they're around in too high concentrations, they can injure the brain. So the corpus callosum is part of the brain that is responsible for ensuring that both sides of your brain are speaking to each other and that they are acting in unison. With increased glucocorticoids, the pathways in the corpus callosum are damaged and the new ones are prevented from forming. So it can impact the way that the both sides of your brain interact with each other. Your prefrontal cortex is responsible for regulating your emotions. And with increased glucocorticoids, it shrinks and there's a loss of regulation of those negative emotions. As we mentioned, the amygdala, we mentioned previously, processes pain and fear. And with increased glucocorticoids comes an increase in activity. So you get a heightened fear response. And then part of the brain called the hippocampus, because it supposedly looks like a bit like a seahorse, and that shrinks. So it becomes really difficult to distinguish between past and present memories. And then after a while, the glucocorticoids drop, and people that have secondary traumatic stress actually end up with a very, very low level of glucocorticoids circulating. So you may be wondering why I've spent the last few slides going into the science and the medical jargon and the nitty-gritty as best as I possibly can from what I have read when I was struggling. Well, there's a few reasons. Firstly, this is how it was explained to me. So the people that have helped me quickly understood that this is how I buy into things. I'm a vet. I spend my entire life immersed in science and medicine and looking for reasons why things are the way that they are. And they realised that to get me to buy into my own treatment, I would need to understand all of this. And I think that almost everyone that works in a zoo, certainly everybody that works in the animal department, has an understanding of biology and illnesses and so on, because we deal with it every day. So I really hope that by explaining it like this, it will help some of you understand it better too. And secondly, I've done this because I really want to demystify the brain. We always think of the brain as being this like really weird thing, but really it's just another part of the body and it can be injured just like any other part of the body. And that's what compassion fatigue and compassion stress are. They're injuries. So these chemical hormones have assaulted the brain and they've made it change shape. Now imagine for a moment that you have a broken leg. So the majority of people would understand that. And if you said you weren't going to put on a plaster cast or take pain relief or use crutches, everyone would think that you were being ridiculous. Yet making time to take care of your brain or talking about it or medicating it is still taboo. And I don't know why. I personally think the only way that we can change that is by starting to see the brain as what it is. And that's just another organ. And it's another organ that sometimes needs some help. And there are people out there that are far more qualified in this than I am, who have written the books that I have read and possibly misinterpreted. So I've explained this how I understand it, but I would really encourage you to go out there and look for information and question and start talking to those medical professionals that understand this on a much higher level, if it helps and if you are interested. So why do animal carers get compassion fatigue? Well, I think the jobs in this sector attract people who are naturally empathetic and compassionate. The very things that can cause issues are the same things that make us great at our jobs. We have the ability to form close bonds with both animals and people, and often, and possibly without realising it, when we're looking after animals, we're also looking after people. And those people can be from a diverse range of backgrounds with different ideas, opinions, etc. We also have the possibility to be exposed to direct trauma, and we frequently have to deal with ethical dilemmas. For someone in my role as a vet, this can be looking after an animal in an emergency or having to discuss euthanasia. For other animal professionals, such as zookeepers, it can be having to look after that sick animal and nurse them, and it can be contributing to the decision-making around that animal's care. I can only speak for vets, but we are notorious for being perfectionists. But I would say that I do know a few zookeepers who are perfectionists too. Other theories that have been offered up include, these careers attract people who put the needs of others before their own. So Carl Jung once described a caregiver archetype, and he said that their greatest fear is selfishness, and their greatest weakness is martyrdom. And then people have also wondered if maybe intensive training and long work hours give the message that our personal needs are irrelevant. Finally, I'd like to just go back to that slide on the World Health Organization definitions of mental health. It is impacted by a wide range of socioeconomic, biological and environmental factors. Think back to the slides on how the brain works. So we discussed some of those hormones and the areas of the brain. Those hormones and those body parts are not exclusive to any gender. We all have them. The gendered brain is a myth. We're all capable of experiencing compassion fatigue. However, I think that societal and cultural restraints are the bits that influence how willing we are to understand mental health and how we talk about it, which can further impact on the state of someone's mental health. And I think this is a particular issue for our male colleagues, and an issue that we really need to address. So this slide lists the signs of compassion fatigue, or as they are also known, the costs of caring. And these are all of the signs of compassion fatigue which I experienced. So let's just try and pick a few out. Isolation, I'd mentioned that at some point I'd stopped socialising as much as I had done previously. I wasn't really phoning my family or friends very much. I wasn't making that not terribly long drive up to see my friend. So I wasn't really around people. I became very isolated, and that certainly didn't help my mental health. And I had a loss of pleasure in life. Like, I just wasn't doing things that I enjoyed. So whether that was exercising or socialising, and it was because I was tired and I just couldn't make time for that in my life. But obviously, I also know now that my dopamine levels were probably very low, so I couldn't really distinguish anything pleasurable, and I didn't have any motivation to try and make those things a priority. I often had difficulty concentrating. I think that was linked to the fact that I couldn't sleep, or when I could sleep, I would have nightmares that would wake me up. And I think that difficulty concentrating actually resulted in some low self-esteem. I was very aware of what my job was. I'm a vet, I have to look after animals and I have to look after people. But because I couldn't concentrate, I'd often find myself second-guessing myself or not having faith in myself, and that resulted in low self-esteem. Like, I was a vet, but I didn't think I was a very good one. And I think probably that played into me feeling burdened sometimes by the suffering of others. Like, I'd find myself getting really angry if somebody asked for help or if somebody just asked me to do my job. The anger also spilled out outside of work into my personal life, and I'd often find that I would just get super angry with my partner about things that really were not a big deal, like leaving a wet towel on the floor or not doing washing up. Like, who cares? But these would be massive deals for me, and I think it was just a displacement thing. And I think that came because I just felt really hopeless and powerless in my situation. Interestingly, I think my partner could see the situation that I was in, and maybe on my clearer days, I could see it. I think there were days that I couldn't see it. On the days that I could see there was an issue, I think I was in denial. So I would just tell myself and tell everybody around me that actually I was okay and that this wasn't a problem. And this is just what it's like being a vet. This is what you go through and what you experience. I think I definitely didn't look after myself during the time that I was struggling. I think in terms of changes in diet, I was maybe making unhealthy choices. So I was eating the quick option maybe rather than the healthiest option, which further impacted my mental health and I think ability to exercise. I just wasn't getting enough energy. And excessive use of drugs or alcohol. So for me, that came in the form of drinking a glass of wine most evenings when I got home from work. I never went into binge drinking. I don't have a particularly addictive personality, so I wasn't a dependency, but I think there definitely was a period where I felt like I had to have a glass of wine with my dinner. I also had depression and an anxiety disorder. These are both very valid diagnoses and they are mental health disorders in their own right, but they often accompany compassion fatigue. I haven't highlighted self-harm and suicide because I've never had any thoughts of self-harm or of suicide, and I've never attempted either of those things, but I felt like I had to put a little asterisk there because there were definitely times where I'd lie in bed and I would just think, wouldn't it be great if I wasn't here or if I didn't have to do this? But I never actually had any ideation or any thoughts about it. So before we move on to how we can mitigate against and treat compassion fatigue, I just want to remind you guys that you guys are gross. I'm not a human doctor. I'm a vet. So I'm just going to talk about treatment modalities that I have read about, coping modalities I've read about, and my experience with some of these. And generally just how we can foster a workplace that tries to mitigate against compassion fatigue. I think if you have any concerns, then you need to go and speak to your HR department, occupational health, and a medical professional, please. So what can we do personally to prevent and recover from compassion fatigue? In this case, almost everything you do and you can do to prevent it and increase your resilience is exactly what is recommended when you're trying to recover. And at the end of the day, if we want to take a selfless approach to this, we're all employed to do a job and we need to do it well. And that job is to look after animals. So why not work on prevention? Keep us working, happy and healthy for longer rather than waiting for it to happen. Prevention is always better than cure. It's always easier than cure. If you're ill, you can't look after your animals. So I would think that the biggest step to overcoming compassion fatigue is acknowledging that it's a thing and that you are susceptible to it or that you could have it. Again, that's why I have gone into the detail of sort of the pathology of compassion fatigue, just to try and make it seem like something that is more real and not some sort of very out there concept that's difficult to understand. The rest of the advice is well documented in many textbooks and help sheets to do with mental health disorders and mental health in the workplace. So some parts will work for some people and other parts won't. And you need to find what works for you, and you need to do that in conjunction with an appropriately qualified person. Finding someone to talk to really helped me. I think hearing those frank conversations when I was in Australia gave me the courage to speak up and go and find help. So I think talking really is the first step in all of this. I personally have found professional help to be really beneficial. But remember there are lots of different types of help out there and you might need to explore those. Personally, I found counselling really unhelpful as I found it really difficult to not get anything back from the counsellor. However, I found cognitive behavioural therapy really good. So that's where you talk about behaviours, how to recognise them, and then you come up with small changes to try and alter your behaviour so that it has a positive impact. And I think maybe that's, again, comes down to the job that I do. I want to know what's happening, what the clinical signs are, and how I can sort it out. But again, maybe some of you might find counselling a bit better, better for you if that's what's needed. I have found that speaking to friends and colleagues can be useful because we can all share stories and understand. But one thing I would say though is if you're using a friend or a colleague, is ask that person if they can talk before you offload on them, just in case they're struggling themselves that day. And don't be upset if they say they can't help. There are also helplines, which you can be signposted towards. I personally haven't used any helplines, but I know people that have, and they have felt that they've been very beneficial. So eating and drinking. This is advice that we've all been given since the beginning of time. Make sure that you're well hydrated, eat a good, varied diet. But there are studies out there that can link both of these to good mental health. So in one study, for example, 120 participants, lowered water intake was associated with increased tension, depression, and confusion. And our brains primarily run on glucose, so it's not unsurprising that fluctuations in blood glucose can alter our moods, even if the pathways by which this occurs are still being investigated and aren't yet fully understood. The impacts that exercise can have on mental health are quite complex and varied. I personally find it a great way to get rid of any excess nervous energy that I have, so I go for a run. I also find running to be really quite meditative, so I find that I'm able to switch off from thinking and I just listen to the repetitive noise of my feet hitting the floor. But there are studies that also show that physical exercise can strengthen parts of your brain, such as the amygdala, the part that we discussed previously that's discussed in assessing threat and pain. And generally when we're active, we feel good about ourselves, and we might even use it as an opportunity to socialise. Both of these feed into those feelings of mental well-being, feelings of contentment and purpose. I do think it's important to develop interests outside of animal care. I suspect there are a lot of animal people who would consider their job to be part of their identity. I mean, I certainly do. And I can understand why we do. We've all worked really hard to get to where we are, and we have to deal with the lives of others, and we work with some truly amazing animals and some truly amazing people, so I can see why we're all invested in this job. But over recent years, I've shifted away from being SJ the vet to SJ who is a vet, and I found that really helps me. I think by realising that I'm so much more than just my job role. I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, a friend, an auntie, a runner, a reader. I found it easier to divide my time and allow myself to switch off from work, and that has been huge. But it's also been difficult to do. But I've realised that allowing myself to switch off from my work actually makes me better at my job. So it gives all of those empathy pathways in my brain some time off and lets my dopamine levels return to normal, so I can then carry on being empathetic and I can practice being compassionate, which are all key features of being a good animal person. I find that taking annual leave regularly throughout the year helps, so even when things are tough, I know that there's something in the diary to look forward to, and it's a time when I can rest my body as well as my head. I know sometimes that can be difficult to do. Obviously you work in a team and you work in an organisation, but just try and take little breaks regularly, even if it's a long weekend, rather than just saving all your annual leave up to one lump sum and then having to work through a huge period of time before you get any rest. And I would also suggest considering what's important to you. So often, like I did, we move away from work. But if you're someone who needs regular contact with family or friends, or that makes you happy, maybe consider prioritising that over where you work. If you value being outdoors, look for work in a scenic location, or that is close to the great outdoors rather than an urban location. There are many ways in which you can contribute to animal care and conservation, just in the same way that there are many ways that I could be a vet. And not all of them involve directly working with animals, but they can be just as rewarding. So if you need to, think outside the box. And finally, I would say don't self-medicate. Here I'm talking about that excessive use of drugs and alcohol. And I'm sure we've all had experiences where a little bit of alcohol has been fun and helped relieve stress. Certainly that's what was happening with me with my glass of wine at dinner. But I'm also sure that we've all found that tipping point, perhaps when we're a bit younger, where you get very drunk and those depressive effects take over. So I think just be aware that alcohol is a depressive, be aware of that tipping point. It probably be dependent on who you are, and just be aware of when it becomes something you need rather than something that is fun and sociable. And I guess probably the most, maybe the biggest piece of advice that I would give, and I don't think that's because it's any more or less important than the other bits, but sometimes I think it's the most difficult thing for us to do, is to acknowledge our strengths and things that have gone well, and to talk about our successes. So I was once told that our brain thrives on positivity, but that negativity was easier for it to process. Studies have shown that positive thoughts can increase areas contacts between neurons in your brain, which increases mental productivity. I think we do have to be really careful with positivity, as I think trying to be super positive all the time can make it really difficult for people to speak up if they're struggling or if they don't agree with something. And also I think we need to be realistic, like life isn't super positive all the time. But one of the things that I learned to do was to just try and make my thoughts a tiny little bit more positive, so I could just open up a few more areas of contact between the neurons in my brain. So if something bad happened, I wouldn't try to make myself better by saying, like, I'm the best vet in the world. I would try and think, like, okay, that was bad, but it could have been worse. And that conversation that I had with the owner or the keeper went really well. So even though the outcome wasn't what we wanted, at least we all understood what happened. And now remember, I keep telling you, I'm not a doctor, so I'm in no position to advise or prescribe. And I want to be clear that this slide is my own opinion based on my own experience. I really do appreciate that medication is not for everyone, and there are lots of things that can surround a person's decision to take it. But there have been times in my life where I have been medicated, and I have found it really beneficial. And I think it's helped level out my brain chemistry whilst I sorted out all of the other things, such as finding time to exercise, taking a period of rest, finding someone to talk to. And once all of that stuff has been in place, I've then been able to come off the medication and I've been fine. I mentioned earlier that my hope is that we would start seeing the brain as just another organ. And I also hope that the taboo surrounding medication for mental health disorders vanishes, and we can discuss it just like any other medication, just like we discuss pain relief for that broken leg. So how can compassion fatigue be mitigated against and treated on an organisational level? Now, I want to be clear, I think we all have a responsibility to take care of our own mental well-being, and that's on no one but ourselves. But we also need to make a living, and organisations still need to be able to function. The ideal situation would be learning to do your dream job in the ideal location while staying mentally fit, but sometimes taking care of your own mental health may involve making some different career choices to what you anticipated, and that could be hard to come to terms with. Doesn't mean that organisations don't have a responsibility to help. Remember that we said that mental health disorders can be impacted by environmental factors, and organisations have control over their working environments. I'm incredibly fortunate at Marwell. We have an excellent HR team. They're always really open, accessible, friendly. I feel like I can talk to them about anything. And they have initiatives a bit like something called the Wellbeing Wheelbarrow. So this comes out into the park, and it normally has cake or biscuits or something equally as naughty in. It carries a message that HR are trying to promote. So I remember one Easter they gave us Easter eggs, but the message was look after your nest egg, so consider your pensions. But it also just gives members of staff a chance to chat to our HR team in a more informal setting. And I know that we all really, really appreciate that. It is in an organisation's best interest to look after their workforce. So mentalhealth.org says that 70 million work days are lost each year due to mental health problems in the UK, and that's estimated to cost approximately £2.4 billion per year. So whilst we leave those big organisational strategies to people who are far more qualified to do that, I think we can all appreciate that on the ground we can help foster a supportive and open working environment. I've added the caveat that that shouldn't be at the expense of our own mental health. Caring for people can have the same impact as caring for animals. There will just be days when you just can't stop and talk to someone about their issues, and that's fine. I just encourage you to be open and honest about it. I usually say, I don't have the headspace for this today, but I do want to help, so come back to me in a few days. I think being open and honest is the best way to foster this environment. When we share our own experiences, we break down the taboo around mental health disorders. And when we share our experiences, we're able to practice being compassionate. And remember, on previous slides, we've discussed how the antidote to compassion fatigue or empathetic distress disorder is actually being more compassionate. So if compassion increases dopamine and drives people to care more for other people and their animals, why wouldn't we encourage this? I'm very fortunate that the department I work in, and especially my veterinary team within the animal department, we are very open and honest, and we are able to share our experiences. Through these discussions, we should do our best to understand each other and how to help. Remember, the World Health Organization doesn't have a strict definition of mental health because it can impact people so differently. I think it could be really easy to assume someone is okay because they haven't responded in a way that you would expect to something. Maybe they don't respond because their life experience has told them it's not okay to respond, or society tells them it's not okay to act a certain way. I think it can be super easy to write someone off as cold or uncaring if they don't show any emotion. Maybe they feel like they can't because of their job. I often feel like I can't show any in my role as a vet. I have to be there to be supportive and to guide people. Or maybe they're just super resilient. Maybe they've worked on themselves, and through the experience they've had, they are now in a better position to handle difficult circumstances. And if that's the case, could you learn something from them? I think as well as learning from your colleagues, it's important to learn about your colleagues. So how do they like to work? What parts of their work negatively impact their mental health? What does poor mental health look like for them? What simple things can you do to help? I know if you have a lot of colleagues, this can seem like a really overwhelming task because everybody is so different. But maybe if we just all got to know one or two different people like this, that small thing could make a big impact on the ground. One of the things that I hear are comments along the lines of, if you find the job tough, then leave, or people with mental health can't do this job. Personally, I think that's complete nonsense. Some of the very values that can predispose people to compassion fatigue are exactly the things that make them excellent animal carers and people that we want to keep within our organisations. Empathy, compassion and kindness. But whilst I don't think we should discount someone because of any health issues, I think we do have a duty to explain the realities of the work that we do and prepare people before they start work. In our professions, we experience heady highs, devastating lows, have amazing successes and resounding failures, and often that's just all in one day. People entering our profession need to be prepared for that roller coaster. It's important to discuss situations as they arise, not only to make sure that everyone is okay, but also to learn from things that happen and see how you can improve next time, whether that's the way we carry out a job or in the way that we handle people. In my vet team, we carry out significant vent audits. So these can be for anything: positive things, negative things, vet procedures, unexpected deaths, communication failures. And the format of the meeting allows everyone to discuss things openly and without blame. If it's a particularly stressful event, such as an unexpected death, we'll wait for a few days before discussing it. And in some instances, we'll also put time aside to discuss how the events have made us feel, rather than the process of the event. Because we all want to improve how we work, but we also don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are still human and things impact us. I think it's vitally important to know your limits and to recognise when you can no longer help. And in these cases, you should help your colleagues seek advice from HR, occupational health, or a medical professional. I think it's really important to be professional. So sometimes some of these suggestions, maybe they seem a bit airy-fairy, or they seem like a lot of hard work, and people might roll their eyes at it. But for one moment, if we focus on staying mentally healthy in the work environment, we are just being professional. Maybe if we think more about the way that we talk to each other and how we deal with difficult situations, treating each other with respect and understanding, we can improve mental well-being at work whilst reducing workplace conflict and increasing output. And all of those things, they will help mental well-being, but they're also really, more tangible things that you can see in front of you. And finally, I think it's really important to challenge societal norms. We say someone is being emotional when they're upset, implying they're irrational or they're not thinking fully. But there are a whole range of emotions out there. Happy, excited, anxious, scared, upset. Not all of those are bad. And in fact, some of these emotions help keep you alive. So why don't we start calling people emotional when they're happy? Instead of saying, why are you so emotional? Why don't we name the specific emotion? Replace it with, you seem a bit anxious, are you okay? And we need to talk about everyone's emotions. When we talk about emotions, there's always an unspoken connotation that they're bad. And often when this is said to women, there's an implication that women are irrational and unable to think straight, because that is what society has said women are. Some of the most rational people I know are women. And yes, sometimes in a crisis, they can lose their ability to think quickly and logically, but so does everyone. Remember, we all have the same parts of the brain and the same hormones involved in compassion fatigue. The gendered brain is a myth. On the flip side of that, some of the people that I know who struggle most with mental health are men. And I believe it's because of the same societal norms that paint women as irrational and emotional tell men that they can't be emotional, or at least they can't show it, because they need to be supportive and make decisions. And this is killing men. Men account for approximately 3/4 of all suicides in the UK, and they have done since the mid-1960s. 1 in 8 men has a mental health disorder. And that is why, even though I'm not a man and I do not identify as one, I wanted to share my story on International Men's Day in the hope that it will help someone, whether that be to speak out, get help, or be a bit more understanding of someone who's struggling. So I wanted to share this slide from the World Health Organization's Black Dog Institute. It's taken from a cartoon called I Have a Black Dog, which I watched on YouTube a few years ago. It refers to depression as a black dog, and the narrator says that whilst he isn't glad he has a black dog, it has taught him a few tricks. And that's exactly how I feel. I would much rather never have experienced what I did in my early career, but I can say I learned a lot from it. I can honestly say I think my struggles have made me more prepared for the tough times in my jobs, and so much more prepared than I ever was when I left vet school. So if I had to end this talk on a positive, I would say, if you are struggling, I'm really, really sorry, and I wish you weren't, but please get help, and just know that all of this is temporary, and you'll learn something from it. And on that note, I will leave you with a photo of Elijah, my black cat who keeps my black dog at bay. Thank you all for listening. And please contact BIAZA if you have any questions that can be forwarded on to me. And I've also put together a list of references which you can request. Thank you.